So good morning, everyone. I think we are able to start now. I would like to welcome you to this semester's fourth EPRC webinar. My name is Liliana Fonseca, and I am a researcher at the EPRC. In normal circumstances, we'd have these seminars to have taken place face-to-face at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And of course, we look forward to doing that again in the future, but still we are delighted to be able to welcome you from a bit all over the world and Europe, probably mostly, in this webinar today, and hopefully for future webinars as well. So today I welcome Dr. Evert Meijers, who will be sharing his research on the topic, Is Regional Policy Little More Than a Cloth for the Bleeding? Distributive Politics in the Netherlands. Very catchy title. The presentation will last for about 30 minutes, and in the remaining time, we will open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. If you would like to make an intervention, I suppose you know kind of the protocol, but you can use the Zoom raise a hand function, or you can also feel free to use the chat function, and we can get to these questions in the Q&A. Before introducing our speaker, of course, I would like to inform you as well that this meeting is being recorded, which means that you and your colleagues have the opportunity to follow the meeting at a later stage. The recording will be made available on our YouTube channel and shared with you by email. And we'd also like to encourage you to, of course, use social media, use Twitter to share your thoughts on the webinar and spread the word about the research of our speaker today. So let me present our speaker. Evert Meijers is Associate Professor in the Department of Human Geography and Spatial Planning at Utrecht University and Trustee of the Urban Studies Foundation. His research focuses on explaining urban and regional inequalities in development through institutional, behavioral, and network perspectives, with the ultimate aim to develop empirically underpinned territorial development strategies that make cities and regions better able to satisfy human and societal needs. So I will thus give the floor to Evert. I'll stop sharing my screen. And let's see. Let me know if you're okay with sharing your screen, or I can just do your, okay.
I'll start. So you see my screen now, I guess? Yes. Okay, great. Well, thanks for the invitation, first of all, and thanks for the introduction. What you see here is a painting by Rembrandt. I'm going to explain later why it is here. I'm not sure about the title. In the Netherlands, we have a saying that something is a clot for the bleeding. I'm not sure whether it's a too literal translation or not, or whether this is kind of saying in the UK in English as well. But I think you will get the point, what it means. Okay. Yeah, it might be strange for a super small country like the Netherlands that is highly connected, but actually we do have regional inequalities. There's a clear core and a periphery and something like a semi-core or semi-periphery in between, of course. But it's quite striking that despite the small size and the very well-connected parts of the country, regional inequalities are actually on the rise. These are just some maps taken from a report that came out last week by one of our main banks in the country, Rabobank. And it shows that some regions are growing much faster than others, and also their economic importance is growing, whereas others are declining demographically and economically. And we are I'm in economic geography group here in Utrecht, and we are kind of inclined to explain whether regions grow or decline on the basis of some kind of endogenous factor. So it's you can explain thriving regions because they have a certain physical capital, or they have the right people, the human capital, they attract talents. They are innovative and they have high quality institutions that know how to lobby, and that that manage the region very well. That's the kind of traditional explanation. And of course, the opposite holds for regions that are in decline. You can blame them for not being smart enough, not being entrepreneurial enough, not having an attractive landscape, for instance, or not being very resilient, or the government might be poor, low quality institutions. There are quite a lot of papers on that. And this kind of suggests, and that's what I try to, the message I try to convey with the picture of this McKinsey report. The subtitle reads, a review of the steps city leaders should take to become successful, right? That it's all kind of a local thing, whether you're a thriving region or a declining region, it's a kind of choice, and you have to make the right decisions, and you will belong to the well-performing ones. And if you don't do that, well, you're to blame. So it's really like, I summarize it as, it's the economy, stupid. My position that I would like to explore in this talk is that it's not the economy, but it's the politics, stupid, I would say. And to explore this proposition, I'm going to address about 6 things. First of all, I have some evidence on spatial patterns in government spending in the Netherlands, and then I will talk about the role of spatial economic narratives in that influence those patterns, the role of policy templates. Then I will talk a bit more about politics, political representation, lobbies, voting patterns, and how they influence the spatial pattern of government spending. It's also about spatial justice. So how can you define spatial justice at the national level? When is national government spending, and how it spatially turns out, how it is spread over different regions? When is it just and when is it unjust? If there's time, I can say a little bit about a particular region in the south of the Netherlands called Zeeuws-Vlaanderen, so close to Flanders in Belgium, that has been in decline, and it's quite evident that our national government has, unwittingly, but still quite actively been hampering the growth of that region, actually stimulates decline, I could even say. I'll try to zoom out again in the last section of this talk when I address the wider implications for regional policy of this Dutch example. Let's about the spatial patterns in government spending. Politics is about who gets what, when, and how. And of course, there's a very clear spatial dimension to this question, who gets what. So you can also, the where question in a way. And that's the realm of distributive politics. There have been quite a lot of studies of distributive politics, some really evident cases came to the fore, like if the prime minister of a country was from a certain region, he or she would stimulate the development of that region more than others. But actually a real systematic overview of how government spending is spatially distributed is missing. And of course, the reason is that it is not very easy to get an overview of this. There are some types of policies, like regional policies or subsidies, that have a clear spatial dimension. But a lot of policies have a spatial dimension. I think every policy has a spatial dimension, but it's not so visible. So for instance, if a government decides to spend more on innovation, it will end up more in certain regions than in others, because there might be more innovative firms in one place and less in the other. So what is missing is that there's no systematic analysis of government spending at the country level. I know people in the UK started working on it. In the context of this leveling up strategy that the government has nowadays. But I know they also face a lot of trouble trying to get that overview. So what do we have? What we do have is anecdotal evidence. Well, I'm just going to show you some pictures that say something about how government spending in the Netherlands is spatially distributed. So we have a multi-year program of investments in infrastructure, so that relates to accessibility, roads, railways, etc. But it's also about protection against flooding, so dikes, etc., are also part of this scheme. And some people in Delft and at the Delta Metropolis Association, which is not in Delft anymore, but some people from Delft University were involved. They have done a very nice overview of where, you know, of all these years, where did the money end up? And the map you can see on the right. And I think what is quite visible is that the majority of government funding on infrastructure ends up in or around the main cities in the Randstad region in the west of the Netherlands. So that's, you know, when you talk about core and periphery, the core in the Netherlands is always the Randstad region. So that the anchors of the Randstad are Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht, if you're less familiar with it. You know, there's a lot of talk about where do we get our gas from. Actually, we get it from the north of the Netherlands as well, from the province of Groningen. And that has given us really billions of euros over the years. Since the 1970s, we've been extracting gas. And there was a study on where did the money that was earned, where did it end up? And it turned out that, well, it was put into a fund to structurally strengthen the Dutch economy. And only 1% of the money that was earned with the gas was spent in the province where it was extracted from the ground, and 90% ended up in the Randstad region. Nowadays, because the Netherlands is one of the lucky countries that can borrow money on the financial markets for a really low interest rates. Actually, we for some time we actually got money if we borrowed big sums, and that was used to fill a national growth fund that was also aimed to stimulate structural and durable economic growth. So in the first tranche of this fund, about 20 billion euro was spent. And it's quite interesting, this was organized as a kind of competition. So local and regional governments could come up with proposals of how to spend the money. And if they were deemed good enough by a committee, and you see the committee members on the right, they would get funding. And part of it was also labeled for infrastructure investments. So this committee was made up of, well, one politician, the chairperson, Dijsselbloem, but also like vice chancellors of universities, consultants, entrepreneurs, a prince even, so a Nobel Prize winner in physics. So it's for me, it's quite strange or quite telling that we just give those 10 people 20 billion and they can decide how it is spread over the country. It's quite amazing, right? So politicians, I think, should take responsibility for such decisions and not just a bunch of experts from society. But aside from that, where did the money end up? Again, 2.5 billion was spent on an extension of the metro from Amsterdam to Schiphol Airport. And also Delft is profiting because the railway tracks between The Hague and Rotterdam are also going to be doubled. So instead of 2 tracks, there will be 4 in the near future. Only 30 million was spent outside of those main metropolitan regions, and it was for Eindhoven. Eindhoven is a kind of excuse city. So if politicians want to avoid the image that or the perception that they are only focusing or dedicating funds to the Randstad region, very often Eindhoven is the lucky one that also gets a very little piece of the share, right? But it's nothing comparable to what the main cities are getting. It's also quite ridiculous to build a metro line to Schiphol Airport, which I think is one of the best connected airports by railways already. And, you know, it will only take more time to get from Schiphol Airport to Amsterdam if you would use the metro. But this is how the money is spent, right? Again, it ends up in the Randstad region. Sometimes there are subsidies, and it's quite easy to also get a view of where does it end up. For years, when giving away subsidies for culture, so for theaters, well, can be anything actually that's related to culture, festivals, etc., exhibits. For years, there was a clear demand that it would be geographically distributed, but that was cancelled as a criterion. And instead, the focus turned to the number of visitors, the level of diversity or inclusiveness, how innovative it was. And that, you know, these new criterions really benefited the Randstad region. So 81% of all the funds for culture ended up in the 4 main cities. And, you know, of course, this gave, this led to a huge debate. A lot of provinces did not get anything of the share. So that was a small political revolt. But it's government spending and the spatial impact of it can also be approached from a different perspective. You can also look, for instance, at how public services are organized and where they are located. And we really have this efficiency mantra has been the dominant narrative in organizing public services. So that has led to a process of scaling up and concentration of a lot of public services. So regions without a big city or low density regions, they really saw the negative impact of this, right? So larger cities profited from this because that's where the public services were concentrated, and actually quite a lot of regions lost a lot of public services. This newspaper article on the right from the Volkskrant, one of our national newspapers, actually tells a story about another scaling up process that is going to be started because it's no longer deemed necessary that people can reach a hospital in 45 minutes, according to medics, because ambulances are equipped much better. And so there's no need to have hospital within 45 minutes reach. And of course, that will be just, this is the preamble for another process of concentration and scaling up that will not benefit, let's say, smaller rural regions. But we've seen this also with law courts. They were reorganized. Healthcare, other types of healthcare, hospitals, especially specialized hospitals, are also much more nowadays in the largest cities. The army was reorganized, the education sector, and so on, and so on, and so on. So actually, there are quite a lot of regions that are really emptied out of a lot of public services that are sponsored by the state. This is quite in contrast with previous decades, right? So in the 1970s, 1980s, the Netherlands had a clear policy of dispersal of public services across the country, because there was a fear that too much was going to end up in the Randstad, that it would be too crowded, too congested, and also some spatial justice considerations. Well, these are state-funded institutions, so we should spread them over the territory. I think the Netherlands was not the only one, right? I think this happened in a lot of countries at that time. Since the 1990s, there actually is a concentration policy. Nobody is using that word, concentration policy. It's a bit hidden, right? So we had a very explicit policy in the 70s, 80s to disperse public services. It had a name, it had a policy, strategy, plan, etc. But the concentration policy that we've seen since the 90s, it doesn't have a name. I just invented it. But it makes what is happening, and I think that is also shown by this pattern of government spending, spatial pattern of government spending, is that we are actually concentrating a lot of government investments disproportionately more in the Randstad region, or especially in the 4 main city regions, and not in the periphery of the country. Of course, this has political consequences. There's a big debate on the places that don't matter. Andres Rodriguez Poza started it, and he clearly sees a pattern that people in regions or places that feel neglected, they take revenge through the ballot box and they have to vote. So, the black color in the figure on the right shows where the percentage of people that don't vote combined with the percentage of people that vote for anti-system political parties is highest. And you can really see the parts of the country that are neglected in some way here, or at least the people that feel neglected. But I think from my anecdotal evidence, I think you can say they are actually neglected. So this is worrying, right? This is worrying in a lot of European countries, and I think we should address this. And it has to do with how we spend or where we spend government funds. Okay, I'm turning to the role of spatial economic narratives. So this concentration policy that I see that has emerged since the 1990s comes forward from a certain narrative that we should not back the losers as we did in the past, but that we should pick the winners. Because we are in a big competition, right, with a lot of other cities and regions beyond the Netherlands. And it makes sense to invest in our trump cards in this competition, the major Dutch cities, because they provide agglomeration economies. And of course, in more or less every economic development theory, agglomeration benefits are a key driver of growth. So for that reason, the focus was on investing in major Dutch cities, in strengthening relationships with other metropolitan regions in Europe and across the world, and also strengthen relations between cities within the Netherlands. And the argument that was used to justify this disproportionate concentration of government spending in the main Dutch cities was, of course, that the benefits of such a strategy would spill over to other countries, would trickle down to other places, so everybody in the end would be happy. So people were saying, what is good for Amsterdam will be good for the country as a whole. Now, the problem is, of course, that those kind of spatial spillovers or trickle-down effects are not very visible at all, right? So when all the public services are disappearing from your region, when plans that your government develops are not funded because the national government doesn't think it's worthy of national government investment because it doesn't add much to the economy, then of course I can imagine the feeling that a lot of people have that they are not getting their share of the cake, right? And I think also the major cities in the Netherlands are very strong. They have very strong lobbies. They've been investing in that a lot as well. So they've built alliances with neighboring cities, with other cities. They have direct access to high-level politicians at the state level. And that has, and they have been saying, okay, right, it's much more economic to, the return on the investment. If you invest in our cities, it's much larger than if you would invest it in some peripheral region. So it makes sense to make the pie bigger, and then maybe later you can redistribute it in a way. And what is also very important to understand when it's about distributive politics is that if you want to get funding as a region, as a peripheral non-core region, you have to fit the policy template. So you have to use the right vocabulary, right? It should be about economic growth. It should be about innovation. This is slowly changing a little bit to welfare, prosperity, spatial justice dimensions being taken into account, but you know that's still marginal compared to the growth and innovation story that you need to tell to convince the national government. Also, there are a lot of cost-benefit analysis. I've seen quite a lot of them. They are called societal cost-benefit analysis, but I think this is always just a calculation of costs and benefits for the national government, which in my view is not necessarily the same as a societal cost-benefit analysis. And you know, I have an issue with cost-benefit analysis, but you cannot put a value, a monetary value on a lot of benefits or costs, but still they are super important. If you want to get investment, there must be some kind of positive balance between costs and benefits according to those kind of analysis. Also, what a study by the Council for Public Government, I think that's the right translation for Raad voor Openbaar Bestuur in the Netherlands, so that's an advisory council to the government. They did a study on how easy it was for non-core regions to get heard in The Hague by national level politicians, and they really detected that all these local politicians, regional politicians, they constantly had to fight the perception that whatever they would do in their region, it was not of any significance for the country as a whole. And that thinking has really sunk into the minds of a lot of civil servants also at the national level, and a lot of politicians. Actually, civil servants probably will not know the region, right? They are also from a lot of them, a disproportionate share of them is from the core region itself. Also, what is very important in government spending is the role of population forecasts. So they're supposed to be a forecast based on trends in the past that are extrapolated. But I think nowadays they have increasingly become self-fulfilling prophecies, right? So if decline is predicted for your region, well, you really have a hard time to convince that it might be, might be not the case, that you can turn the tide, or in some way, you know, yeah, if demographic decline is predicted, you have kind of lost already. Whereas in the past, population forecasts were kind of a call to action for government. So, okay, we might want to change this trend that is being forecasted. Nowadays, it's more like, okay, this is going to happen. It's taken on face value, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. Also, what does not matter in the policy template, the policy frameworks that you need to adhere to, is whether or not a plan makes a difference. So we only look at a certain plan and not at the regional context in a way. And this is where this painting by Rembrandt comes into play. It's called the Standard Bearer, Vaandeldrager in Dutch. It was acquired last year from a rich French family, and the Dutch state paid 175 million euros for it, which is, in my view, quite a bit high amount for a painting that is just one of the many and not that special for Rembrandt. But there was an interesting debate. You know, this was paid for by all Dutch taxpayers. And, you know, it was for everybody, it was evident that it would go to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. But you can question, as some politicians from peripheral regions did, so does it really matter for the Rijksmuseum to have 23 instead of 22 of those Rembrandts? Or, you know, it could also be the top piece of a museum somewhere in the periphery of the Netherlands, and it would really make a big difference, right? For the Rijksmuseum, it does not make any difference, in my view. And that holds for a lot of projects, right? So there was a marine base going to be developed in Vlissingen, Flushing. in the south of the Netherlands, and then it didn't happen, and it went to another place. And you know, for this region in the south, it would have made a big difference. But where it is now, somewhere near Utrecht, yeah, you know, doesn't make any difference. So, in my view, politicians should look more into the question: does it make a difference given the regional context? We do have a kind of regional policy in the Netherlands since 2017, a new kind of policy. It's called region deals. So it's supposed to fund projects that foster prosperity in the broadest sense of the word. So that includes also, it's supposed to make people healthy, happy, richer, more educated. It can also go into the environment, that it's more sustainable, etc. So it's really a very broad interpretation, much more broad than the narrow economic competitiveness and innovation story that has been dominant. And about €1 billion is being spent in 4 years, and it was spread over 30 projects in the first round. And the regions, they have to come up with good proposals, so they compete with each other to obtain funding. And it should not just be a province or something, it should be a network of collaborating partners. And the regions themselves have to pay 50% of the costs, and the national government adds another 50%. I'll get back to that later. But I first want to explain something about political representation. And unlike a lot of other European countries, there's no regional dimension in our electoral system. How do I say that? The election system. So it's not that you vote for someone from your region. No, it's, you know, you vote for a party and that's it. And that actually leads to big differences in political representation across the Netherlands. So whereas the Randstad region, so the green area on the map, is represented by about 14 members of parliament per 1 million inhabitants. The semi-periphery, so the yellow area and the periphery itself, the red area, they are represented by just 5 members of parliament per 1 million inhabitants. So that's you know, almost 3 times better representation for the Randstad region. Of course, you can expect politicians to, you know, they are voted in. They are supposed to not represent a particular region, but supposed to represent the country as a whole. But it's not rocket science to think or understand that it will be much easier to get issues from the Randstad on the political agenda nationally, right? Because a lot of members of parliament actually experience those issues themselves. And this divide in political representation has gone up and since 1971. So it's about access to decision making. As I told already, a lot of big cities have very good lobbying strategies. They actually invest a lot of money. They have the size to do so, right? They are large enough to devote quite some efforts to lobbying, and they have been very successful in making clear that their city regions are the motors of the economy. And it's much easier for an alderman of a big city in the Randstad to access a minister than it is for the political representative of a region, a peripheral region, to get an appointment in The Hague. So I think that's important. And the big cities know how to play the game much better than the region, I would say. Of course, even though you would hope it's not the case, but politicians cater to the needs of their voters. So they look very much into where are their voters based. So when I showed that picture of people that do not vote anymore or vote for anti-system parties, they are really shooting themselves in the foot, right? Because it is not going to help them in any way. It just shows that the ruling parties, they have not much to gain from those regions. So why cater to their needs? We have changing coalitions, unlike the UK. It's always a combination of different parties that have the power. But one constant for the last 12 years has been that the VVD, so the Liberal Party, has been the largest. So Mark Rutte, he's from that party. And, their natural area of where the voters live is typically the Randstad region. So that also explains why there's much more investment in the Randstad region. Let me talk about some interpretations of spatial justice. So when is government spending done in a spatially just way? There are two approaches. There's one is a utilitarian approach. Here it is being said that it's based on the utility. So when most people profit from a certain investment, more people get happy, then it's the right investment to do, even when it might be at the expense of a small minority group somewhere elsewhere in the country. So using this utilitarian perspective, it's logical that you would invest much more in the largest cities, right? You can build a bridge across a river in Rotterdam, and much more people will use it than if you would build a bridge somewhere across a river, somewhere in the periphery. But a net gain in utility for the country as a whole may hide actually increasing inequalities between different regions. So some regions may be worse off. And the opposite, of course, is the egalitarian perspective, as advocated by John Rawls, for instance. And it says, well, we should treat people equal and they should have the same rights. That is basically what it comes down to. And they say, well, there might be regional inequalities, but just as long as inequalities are not coming forward from what he considers morally arbitrary circumstances. So when you're born, for instance, in a poor family, or belong to a minority group, that is not acceptable if that leads to inequalities. And you can ask yourself the question, so if you are born in some peripheral non-core region, is that an arbitrary circumstance that should not have an impact on your prospects or outlook to live a happy, productive life? So what political parties do, especially when there are elections, and I'm a bit cynical here, they do pay lip service to egalitarianism, but actually if you look at the policy and how government money is being spent, it's very much done in a utilitarian way. And that's also because these policy templates, policy frameworks, these cost-benefit analysis, etc., they actually look at the utility for rather than at equality. I think I don't have time for a case in the south of the Netherlands, but it's not relevant. I want to go back to the region deals, so this new policy program. If I'm again a bit cynical, this is a very politically very nice strategy, right? It leads to a lot of newspaper articles in local and regional newspapers, showing politicians shaking hands like, okay, we had this great deal, the government is going to fund this or that in our region, isn't that great, right? So, but if you think about it, I think, I'm not sure what kind of word I could use for it, but there's of course greenwashing going on in the fossil fuel sector, but I think there's also kind of regional greenwashing, right? So even though there's a super dominant concentration policy that a lot of investments are actually ending up in the Randstad region, this is really a policy program that allows national level politicians to say, oh, hey, but we also do something for the region, right? And in my view, it's not much more than that. so the funds are also extremely limited, right? So whereas there are billions going into the Randstad region, especially into the 4 main cities, there are just a couple of millions going to the regions, and that can never compensate for the long tradition of transferring billions from the periphery to the core, right? And my suspicion is, or my feeling is that this is actually true for a lot of countries, that there's some kind of regional policy existing that helps to show that, okay, we take care of certain peripheral non-core regions, so we are not investing everything in the country, even though if there's a much more hidden transfer of billions of euros to the core region going on. So that's why I came up with this title. I think that regional policy is little more than a clot for the bleeding. And actually, in my view, it does not even stop the bleeding. Maybe to zoom out a little bit. I've seen quite a lot of papers that are critical about cohesion funding. Of course, the recently issued cohesion report says that Eastern European countries are catching up, but also that domestic inter-regional inequalities are rising in a lot of countries. You know, previously also regional inequalities have been rising, and that has led to a lot of debate on the effectiveness of cohesion funding. But in my view, you can never judge the effectiveness of cohesion funds if you do not take into account how national governments distribute their investments across the country, right? And I think there's a hidden transfer from a lot of peripheral regions that are being helped by cohesion funds to the metropolitan core areas in their countries. And maybe this is true for the UK as well, right? I think there's a book, Triumph of the South, that was published a long time ago. It shows how the economic core has really shifted from, let's say, more the north of England to the south. And that this is also very much due to a lot of government investment, right? So that it was not just economic mechanisms that you cannot stop or something. No, it was a really proactive strategy of the government. And I think especially now that the cohesion funds have disappeared, I think it's smart by the Conservative Party that there should be some kind of leveling up strategy to still foster development elsewhere in the country. Also because, of course, the southeast of the UK is getting overheated a lot. So this story might also be relevant for the UK. I would like to finish with some recommendations for research, first of all. So I think when studying regional development, we should not just look at endogenous factors, as a lot of economists, regional economists, economic geographers do, but we should factor in the role of distributive politics at the national level. Of course, there's a big challenge that we should move beyond the anecdotal evidence that I was also presenting on the spatial distribution of government spending. And we have to quantify it in some way and over a very long period. And I think we should explain regional development much more from an institutional perspective. And this institutional perspective, of course, should involve distributive politics at the state level and not just the quality of government within regions. So policy-wise, I think it's really strange, but maybe that's a normative point of view that national governments pick the winners or the regions that they think will be the winners. And of course, this then will become kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So Amsterdam might be very, you know, they are claiming their success, but you can also question, okay, which part of that success was actually, is actually explained by being privileged with government funding. In my view, governments should adopt a more egalitarian interpretation of spatial justice. And this should also translate into the policy templates that are being used. And as I said, don't evaluate the effectiveness of cohesion policy without taking national distributive politics into account. So thanks very much for listening and watching. And if there are any questions or remarks, I'm of course happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Evert. That was a very nice presentation. Nice way to end it as well.
Longer than I
now...
had hoped. Sorry for that. Yeah. Should I stop sharing or?
Yes, please. This way we can maybe see everyone a bit better and see whoever might have any questions. Oh, I see one already from Nigel. Please go ahead, Nigel. You can unmute yourself.
Well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you for a fascinating talk. I thought it was very stimulating and thought-provoking. The thought it provoked in my mind is that the situation is actually even worse than described, in that in the UK, at any rate, government policy disguises or hides the level of concentration in the southeast. Much spending in the southeast is classified in UK government terms as being of national benefit. So, for instance, the cost of running the underground in London and the cost of many of the transport, the very, very expensive transport infrastructure in London is classed as national expenditure rather than as London expenditure. I think the same thing happens to a limited extent in Scotland, as far as Edinburgh is concerned. And I wonder if that's something that happens elsewhere in Europe.
Yeah, it's nice to see that this story probably also holds, and probably even more in the UK. And actually, I did with Rodrigo Cardoso. We once did a study of the spread of urban functions across European cities, including basically all European cities, almost 2,000. And we looked at whether there were headquarters or firms, or whether there were big theaters, stadiums, big exhibitions, etc. A lot of what you could call urban functions. And we found that actually in every European country, there's a kind of surplus that we could not explain of metropolitan functions, urban functions in the capital city region. So I think it was in the range of 25%. So they would have about 25% more urban function in general. It was a long list of types of things we were looking at. Then you would expect, given their size and their demographic weight, basically. So I think this holds true in a lot of countries, but in some countries more than others. I think what we also found was, if the country had a quite polycentric urban system, like Germany or Switzerland, or also a little bit the Netherlands, of course, you would see that this surplus was slightly less. And in countries like France or Greece, with a very dominant capital, this surplus would be much higher, right? So there should be balancing powers elsewhere in the country to avoid this. And the UK is a strange example, because it actually is not that monocentric, but it's rather polycentric, and still it has an enormous disproportionate share of metropolitan functions in London compared to the other big cities. Actually, you could say that a lot of cities, especially in the north of England, are in what you could call an agglomeration shadow of London, right? So, and there's not much growth in the shadow, as we know. An agglomeration shadow is an interesting concept in economics as well. Yeah. That can be used in this context, yeah. But I also, I was struck by your word, disguising and hiding. It's quite interesting that when there was a policy of dispersal, this was very explicit, right? This was communicated to everyone. There's a dispersal policy. See how good we are. We spread it all over the country. And when, there's a clear or hidden, but still evident concentration policy. It's nowhere it's written down, right? It's also in the Netherlands, it's hidden very much. Actually, we don't have any national government dealing with spatial development anymore, so that also explains it maybe a little bit. It's returning, by the way. Yeah.
Thank you, Evert. I don't know if you want to follow up on that, Nigel, or if anyone else might have a question right now. I think Martin has unmuted himself. Please go ahead.
Hi. I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of getting a new sort of computer set up, so my camera's not working yet, but thanks very much, Evert, for a great presentation, really interesting. I just have one quick question or maybe something to clarify a little bit is the role or the influence of any like fiscal equalisation arrangements in the Dutch case, in terms of this sort of redistributive element. How important or unimportant is that? Is there scope for that to play a more prominent role?
Well, yeah, it's well, the Netherlands is so small that we actually we all put our tax money in one big pot at the national level, and then it's redistributed to municipalities, to provinces in part, and actually the most, or I think the largest part is held at the national level and then spent somewhere, right? So. It's not that regions or cities get more funding from taxes when they have more firms or when they grow, or it doesn't matter so much. So there's some equalizing mechanism there, right? But it also means that when the national government when government investments in certain regions are much higher than in another one, that this is really being paid for by the whole of the country, right? So. The case I was going to show was this peripheral region in the southwest. They are actually paying for the infrastructure in Amsterdam, but Amsterdam is not paying for the infrastructure over there because it's not deemed of any national interest. So that's, you know, I'm really worried about the political consequences of this. You know, we were first looking at this, how strange that these people are voting for anti-system parties, etc. But, you know, the system parties are not, you know, don't fail to deliver on their promises of a more egalitarian distribution of funding. It's explainable that a lot of people vote for anti-system parties or don't vote anymore at all. It's not just a subjective feeling that they are being neglected. I think that it's also quite objective that they are, in fact, being neglected. Yeah. And I'm living in a part that has benefited a lot from this policy, right? But, yeah.
Thanks, Evert. Yeah.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. Pedro, if you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question as well.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation. So I only have two very quick questions. One is, of course, you drew a lot of your analysis from the case of the Netherlands. If I know I don't know that much about the Netherlands, but I do think it's one of the countries that, like in the 80s, decided it wasn't going to do any spatial equalization. And since then, but you do have an example, for example, like Germany, where regional equalization has been a big part of its national policy over the last, well, since reunification, really. So I was wondering whether we can learn something from those examples. The other issue is, you talk at the end about redistribution. I mean, one of the reasons why countries like the UK and France stop doing redistribution is because you create these cathedrals in the desert that only stayed there while there were subsidies, and then as soon as the subsidies ended, they left. And so, okay, I do agree that we need redistribution, but what form should it take? Thank you.
Yeah, well, what is redistribution? I think we need to have an equal spread of government funding over the country, and that we, I think now, you know, with a lot of public services, for instance, we are reaching a level, you know, it has become so effective. For instance, the criminal courts have been reorganized, and now a lot of people don't even show up anymore when they are supposed to be in court, right? So I think that, you know, it's just too far for quite a lot of people. So we are, you know, the minimum level of availability of public services, I think we are in a critical danger that we are getting below that level. So I think you should guarantee a certain minimal presence, availability, accessibility of public service across the country. And sometimes it's, you know, things cost a little bit more when it's in the periphery. And maybe that's just a fact. And, you know, public services should not be funding themselves necessarily, right? The Netherlands, there was a French writer that said that the Netherlands is being run like a company rather than as a country. I kind of feel this is true. It's all about efficiency and effectiveness, but sometimes things, especially the spatial distribution of public service, it doesn't necessarily have to be efficient, right? Being accessible is just equally important in my view. But of course, cathedrals in the desert, yeah, it's, I'm not calling for another policy of dispersal or another redistribution from the Randstad to the other parts of the country. I'm just calling for a more fair balance, right? So actually there should not be a dispersal policy and there should not be a concentration policy, but something in between that everybody just gets its share yeah, but that's a normative point of view, of course. But yeah, what can we learn from other countries like Germany? Every country has its own specifics, and it's right that you and Martin were questioning about the fiscal system. That plays a big role, I guess, in how things are organized. So that's important context to take into account, and you should not, of course, transfer any findings easily between different countries without acknowledging this context. But I think this team is getting momentum. I'm seeing quite a lot of people interested in how it is going in their country, so it might be interesting to have more comparative work on this later. So thanks for the question. Yeah.
Thank you, Pedro and Evert, for your reply. I know we're coming up to the time, and if no one else has a question, I would just like to make one comment, maybe myself, about one of the things that you showed in your presentation is how sometimes those non-core regions even have to fight this discourse that whatever they do in those regions is not important. And I wondered then if we could maybe start then by valuing as well some of the things that are done in those regions, be it linked to foundational economy or even agriculture or other things. So that's something that is actually very, of course, foundational to a country, and we're not really maybe emphasizing it as much.
No, we are in complete agreement about that, I guess. Yeah, for me, it's just, it's so strange that we are privileging regions that have everything already, right? They have a young population, a highly educated population. They have the physical attractiveness. They have historical cities. They have the universities. They have a lot of firms that are super diversified. And still, even though they don't need any support, we are giving them even more to grow. Whereas there are a lot of other regions with every region has its characteristics, unique characteristics, strengths that we could use to develop further. And there should not be, how do you say that, like one policy being implemented for every region. And actually, that's also what I like about this region deal. I'm a bit critical about the money going on being spent in that program. But actually it looks at the local needs, regional needs, and then develops a program. So that, it's a combination of national government actors interacting with the local and regional actors, stakeholders. So that's, that's a way to make sure that really the needs of each individual region are met. And so I'm actually very positive about that part. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we can end with some positive or optimistic views. Yes, so since we've come up to the time, I will just end the seminar here. And I would like to thank you, Evert, and of course, thank you for everyone that has attended today. Our next webinar will be on June 15th, when Dr. Reid van Sinar, a research associate at Western Norway University of Applied Sciences, will present on the role of universities in the periphery linked to innovation and regional development. So that might be a good segue. And yes, contact us to register for our mailing list and keep up to date on any of our future events. And we hope to see you all again. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks so much. Have a nice day.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.